You get so quiet when I come to the podium. I should do this in class. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Father Gabriel Pavarnik. I'm the director for the Center for Catholic and Dominican Studies here at Providence College. Today is our St. Catherine of Siena lecture, one of the 4 lectures that are endowed with the center that we give each year. And this particular lecture deals with spirituality and evangelization, or any kind of intersection around the spirituality of the church. It is my delight to welcome today Dr. Stephen Shoemaker here among us. Dr. Shoemaker earned his PhD from Duke University in 1997. His primary interests lie in the ancient and early medieval Christian traditions, and more specifically in early Byzantine and Near Eastern Christianity. His research focuses on early devotion to the Virgin Mary, Christian apocryphal literature, and Islamic origins. He has published numerous studies on early Christian traditions about Mary, especially in the Apocrypha, including the ancient traditions of the Virgin Mary's Dormition and Assumption, published by Oxford University Press back in 2002, a study of the earliest traditions of the end of Mary's life that combines archaeological, liturgical, and literary evidence. Professor Shoemaker has recently published a translation of the earliest Life of the Virgin, attributed to Maximus the Confessor, from another reputable press, Yale University Press, in 2012. It's pivotal, if often overlooked, late ancient text that survives only in a Georgian translation. Currently, he's finishing a book on the beginnings of, I think you've already finished this, but maybe I'm wrong, is finishing a book on the beginnings of Christian devotion to Mary and completing the translation of several 8th century Christian martyrdoms from the early Islamic Near East. Dr. Shoemaker has been awarded research fellowships from the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Institute for Advanced Study, the National Humanities Center, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. You have no free time. It's indeed, actually he really does. He's a delight. It's indeed my pleasure to welcome here Dr. Stephen Shoemaker.
Good afternoon or evening or whatever it is at 5 o'clock. Thank you, Father Pavarnik, for the introduction and also for making arrangements for me to come down here from Cambridge and speak to you all. My thanks also to Margaret for making the arrangements. And I have to thank, in absentia, my very good friend, Father Dave. Father Ulrich, you may know him as Father Dave, and I go back a long way to Eugene, and he's been a close friend for many, many years, and it was actually getting in touch with him that I think first got this whole ball rolling in the first place. What I'm going to talk to you about today is kind of an overview of this book that Father Pavarnik just mentioned that is actually, it's done, and it is going to be out really soon. In fact, I should have my copies of it probably in a week. It's going to be called Mary in Early Christian Faith and Devotion, and it will also be Yale University Press. Got to make a plug, right? I think it won't be available in the U.S., though, until the summer. I work with an editor for Yale in the London office of all the stupid things, but that's just how it works. So the book has to take a while to literally get shipped over here. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is kind of an overview of what that work was. In essence, the book came about out of some frustration that I had at a very deeply entrenched position that there was no Marian devotion in early Christianity. And the more and more I worked on Mary and early Christianity, the more I just thought, this is madness. And so this book was kind of an effort, maybe self-therapy, to kind of work all this out for myself and see just what there was and what there wasn't. There's more than I think we thought, but not as much as some of us would like. So with that, we'll get things in gear here. Move this away a little bit. I'm not a very quiet person, usually. So, it is rather remarkable, I think, that even at this late date, there is still no satisfactory study of the development of Marian piety in ancient Christianity, at least for another week. In view of the considerable importance that devotion to the Virgin Mary has held over the course of Christian history, one might expect that by now there would be any number of monographs on this topic. But as others have noted before me, perhaps most notably Averil Cameron, such a comprehensive study remains lacking. This absence became quite clear to me some 20 years ago as I began research for my first book on the ancient traditions of Mary's Dormition and Assumption. In setting out, I simply assumed that the origins of Marian piety would already be well mapped onto the history of early Christianity. And I still recall my astonishment when one specialist on early Byzantine spirituality suggested that I might find in the early Dormition and Assumption traditions the origins of Marian intercession. Surely such a matter had long been settled, I naively thought. Yet despite the existence of a number of fine articles and even several monographs on specific aspects of Marian devotion in late antiquity, there was then, and still is now, no adequate treatment of Marian piety's emergence within the history of early Christianity. It is almost as if Peter Brown, the great historian of this period, late antiquity, once wrote of early devotion to the saints. I quote him on the saints here. The same thing seems as true in regard to Mary. Marian veneration, and I quote, as it emerged in late antiquity, became part and parcel of the succeeding millennium of Christian history to such an extent that we tend to take its elaboration for granted, end quote. And I note also that Mary is absent from this historian's seminal work on the cult of the saints. He does all this great work rehabilitating the cult of the saints and doesn't ever mention Mary once. What's up with this? It's so strange to me. Of course, there's been much previous investigation of Marian doctrine during the early Christian period, but such studies generally pay scant attention to the emergence of Marian devotion and cult, preferring instead to focus on Mary's position in the development of early Christian dogma. And likewise, there has been a significant amount of Roman Catholic scholarship on Mary in early Christianity, much of it coming toward the end of the so-called Marian century of 1850 to 1950. Nevertheless, unfortunately, these works often show a strong tendency toward dogmatic readings of the evidence that seek to align early Christian history with modern Roman Catholic doctrine. And occasionally, they are also overly optimistic about how quickly veneration of the Virgin Mary took hold within ancient Christianity. While such perspectives have an obvious value in a Roman Catholic context, they hold limited use for understanding the historical development of early Christianity and Mary's place therein. Accordingly, it would appear that a history of early Marian piety still remains to be written. I wish I could promise that my talk today with the book that's coming out, I could completely dispel all the fog that presently surrounds the origins of devotion to the Virgin. But unfortunately, the limitations of our evidence preclude such an outcome, a fact that no doubt is largely to blame for the relative neglect of this subject. Instead, what I hope to offer is a new approach to this topic that will contribute to a better understanding of how Mary emerged as a major focus of Christian devotion. There is certainly much more to be said about Mary's role in early Christianity than I can cover this afternoon or even in my forthcoming book. And no doubt additional sources relevant to early Marian piety will continue to emerge. But one of the main goals of this project was to assemble the scattered and often overlooked evidence for early Marian piety from the beginnings of Christianity, from the New Testament even, up to and including the events of the Third Ecumenical Council, the Council of Ephesus, which met in 431. And of course, this council is very famous in terms of devotion to Mary because this is where Mary was famously proclaimed the Theotokos, right, which is a big fancy Greek word that means the one, not mother of God, but the one who gave birth to God. It's an important difference, actually. Nevertheless, since there is virtually no evidence of any devotion to Mary prior to 150, or for that matter to any other figure besides Jesus, as a practical matter, I've focused my attention primarily on the period from the latter half of the 2nd century to the first half of the 5th. And the reasons for selecting this chronological window are fairly obvious. As I've just indicated, the Council of Ephesus is widely recognized as a watershed event in the history of Marian piety. In fact, the explosion of devotion to the Virgin that took place in the aftermath of this council was so significant that much previous scholarship has credited this council itself and its decisions with giving rise to the cult of the Virgin almost single-handedly. This is the sort of standard view you'll find in most books on early Christian studies. It is now increasingly clear, however, that devotion to the Virgin and even her cultic veneration had begun well before the Council of Ephesus even convened. And there is significant evidence that the controversies of this Third Council themselves were at least partly fueled by an already vibrant devotion to the Virgin Mary in Constantinople and elsewhere in the Roman Empire. So while the Christological controversies about this guy Nestorius and his views of the incarnation, which were the main focus of the council, was certainly upsetting to many of the more learned participants in the council, it was this heretic Nestorius' refusal to call Mary Theotokos that seems to have turned the tide of popular opinion against him. And although questions will remain as to just how much Marian piety may have determined the debates of this council and their outcome, there can be little question that widespread devotion to the Virgin played an important role in the broader conversation at this time. In the end, however one may estimate the relation between Marian piety and the events of this important ecumenical council, there can be no mistaking that in the council's aftermath, devotion to the Virgin intensified considerably and spread widely. As a scholar of early Marian devotion, Brian Daly aptly observes of this, during the middle of the 5th century, I quote him, "The figure of Mary emerged like a comet in Christian devotion and liturgical celebration throughout the world," end quote. Scholars of early Christianity have long struggled to comprehend this dramatic expansion of Marian piety after Ephesus, particularly in light of the apparent paucity of evidence for devotion to the Virgin from previous centuries. It is, in fact, true that most Christian sources from the first 4 centuries have surprisingly little to say about Mary. Early, quote-unquote, Orthodox writers enlist her motherhood as a guarantee of Jesus' humanity, her virginal conception as a sign of his exalted status. Her obedience at the Annunciation rectifies the disobedience of Eve, making Mary a new Eve for the new Adam. And her persistence in virginity is a model for other virgins. There is, however, little interest in Mary in her own right, and almost no evidence of Marian cult before the middle of the 4th century. Such relative silence is indeed difficult to reconcile with the thriving Marian piety that we suddenly find in the 5th century, particularly in the Eastern Mediterranean world. Nevertheless, despite the limitations of the evidence and the convictions of much earlier scholarship, the notion that the abstruse theological debates about this Nestorius' Christology at the Third Council could somehow have generated the cult of the Virgin with such apparent velocity seems frankly rather preposterous. While the council's outcome and its proclamation of Mary as Theotokos obviously catalyzed the growth and spread of Marian cult, there can also be little question that veneration of Mary had already begun to establish itself before the events of this council. The difficulty, however, lies in finding clear evidence of devotion to Mary during the first 4 centuries that can offer meaningful precedent capable of explaining the eruption of Marian piety that took place in the middle of the 5th century. And although such evidence is surprisingly scarce, given Mary's prominence in the later Christian tradition, it is nonetheless sufficient that we can sketch a history of early Christian devotion to Mary. There are, in fact, many traces of incipient Marian piety from the pre-Ephesian period, a number of which are by now well known. But these are scattered and often faint, making it difficult to judge their overall significance as witnesses to emerging devotion to the Virgin. One of the most famous of these is a text some of you may have heard of, some of you may not have. A text known as the Proto-Evangelium of James. This is one of these apocrypha. It's a late 2nd century biography of Mary, that tells the story of her youth from her own conception through the nativity of Christ. The Protevangelium of James reveals a surprisingly developed interest in the Virgin as a significant figure in her own right, as well as early devotion to her unique holiness in the later 2nd century, although there is admittedly no evidence yet of any cultic veneration. Right? By this I mean there's no ritual, there's no feast day, right? There's no prayer to Mary. Nevertheless, the remarkably advanced Marian piety of the Protevangelium stands at a considerable distance from the widespread devotion to Mary that we find in the 5th century. And it is not, even still I can say, it's not at all clear what happened in between. As one scholar notes, I quote, "The Protevangelium seems so developed for its date, and in a sense, so isolated. It needs to be set in the broader context of apocryphal writings of a similar period." And this, in essence, is one of the main things that I've attempted to do in this book I've produced, to bridge the Protevangelium with the Marian piety of the 5th and later centuries through the Marian traditions of the 2nd and especially the 3rd and the 4th centuries, especially looking at apocryphal literature. So in order to accomplish this bridging, one must examine a wide range of sources, including a number of long overlooked and some recently discovered texts, as well as other more familiar witnesses to early Marian piety, like the just mentioned Protevangelium. In particular, the apocryphal literature of early Christianity offers a significant, if largely neglected, witness to early Christian interest in Mary. These extra-biblical writings, and especially the early Dormition and Assumption Apocrypha, which are very close to my heart, present much clearer evidence of devotion to the Virgin than one finds, for instance, in the writings of the Church Fathers. Indeed, it would appear that a focus largely on patristic sources is at least partly responsible for leading earlier scholars to the conclusion that Marian veneration was largely unknown in the early Church. For whatever reason, Marian piety seems to register more clearly in apocryphal and also liturgical texts than it does in theological or moral treatises. Why it is more visible in these contexts than in the writings of the early Christian intellectuals and bishops that we name the Fathers, admittedly is not entirely clear. Yet the evidence of early devotion from the apocryphal writings could seem to suggest, and this is one possibility I've floated in dealing with this, could seem to suggest that Marian piety may have first developed in contexts outside the purview of the quote-unquote Orthodox Church authorities, in heterodox or other theologically marginal, heretical is another word for this, right? Communities. I'm being politically correct here. The sharply heterodox contents of some of these texts could appear to confirm such a hypothesis. And occasionally these sources reveal understandings of Mary that are decidedly different from those related by the Church Fathers. Some early Christians, for instance, remembered the Virgin Mary as a learned teacher of the divine mysteries. In any case, as we will see, these texts afford clear evidence that Marian veneration had come into existence already by the 4th century at the latest, even if the Church Fathers in the main seem to have kept their distance from this practice prior to the 5th century. Scholarly response to the admittedly sparse state of our evidence for devotion to Mary during the early centuries has varied a great deal, although generally it has fallen into one of two directions, usually according to confessional orientation. Such a sectarian divide certainly comes as no great surprise, particularly given Mary's often volatile status in the history of Protestant and Catholic debate, where her veneration has long posed one of the major theological boundaries separating these two Christian communities. And despite the convergence of much Catholic, Protestant, and secular scholarship on Christian origins over the past several decades, as one Protestant scholar observes, I quote, "The differences between Catholic and Protestant perspectives on Mary remain significant," end quote. And I would agree with this. Although one hesitates to generalize about something as diverse as modern Roman Catholicism, there has been a tendency in much earlier Catholic scholarship, as I noted previously, to maximize the somewhat limited evidence for early Marian piety. One of the most common solutions to the problem of the evidence is to find ways, again, as I said before, of reading modern Mariological dogmas back into the writings of the New Testament and early church fathers. Such an approach finds passages from early Christian literature that seem reminiscent of modern Catholic doctrines. And despite a clear absence of such beliefs from early Christian literature when read on its own terms, and obvious contextual difficulties with many of these readings, on such basis it is often alleged that the Marian dogmas of modern Catholicism belonged to the primitive church. While such an interpretive move is, I would acknowledge, entirely appropriate within the context of Catholic dogmatics, where confidence in the eternal truth of the Church's teaching effectively requires such readings of the early evidence, these ultimately apologetic exercises fail to shed any historical light on the actual emergence of Marian piety. On the Protestant side, other than general neglect, the tendency has been to emphasize the dearth of information, and on this basis to refuse the existence of any significant devotion to the Virgin prior to the middle of the 5th century. The Council of Ephesus is thus often adduced as the sole and sufficient cause for what amounts to an essentially medieval cult of the Virgin. In this way, the early church can be made into a largely Mary-free zone, well suited to Protestantism's rejection of the elaborate and intense devotion to Mary that characterizes its parent faith. Recent decades, it is true, have seen some renewed Protestant interest in Mary, no doubt much of it inspired by broader academic and theological concerns with women's history and gender. Nevertheless, by and large, such studies tend to focus primarily on exegesis of Mary's appearances in the New Testament, as one might expect, rather than on Marian doctrine or veneration. It is also worth noting that this narrative of Mary's relatively late arrival on the scene also appears in a kind of what I would call post-Protestant guise in certain more secular accounts that take a similar approach. And unfortunately, here, as in much earlier Protestant scholarship, a sort of anti-Catholicism occasionally stands fairly close to the surface. Not surprisingly, these confessional dynamics have done little to foster what I would consider critical study of early Marian piety. Happily, however, it would appear as if this gap is beginning to narrow, as many mainline Protestant theologians have begun to grapple with the fact that their acceptance of the first 4 ecumenical councils makes Marian devotion somewhat difficult to ignore completely, while Catholic scholarship has shown an increasing willingness to embrace historical critical scholarship, particularly since the Second Vatican Council. Yet the fact remains that outside of Catholic circles, little consideration has been given so far to the possibility that Christians may have begun significant veneration of the Virgin Mary prior to the Council of Ephesus. And likewise, much, but certainly not all, of the earlier work by Catholic scholars has been essentially apologetic or dogmatic in nature, and thus is of very limited historical value. And so, again, it would seem that in many respects, historical investigation of the early development of Marian piety has just begun, and it will now be essential to look back beyond the events of the Council of Ephesus in order to discover its roots. No less problematic in the study of early Marian piety has been a persistent urge to discover an explanation for Marian veneration that locates its genesis primarily in some larger cultural influence extraneous to the Christian tradition. In this respect, much current scholarship on the origin of Marian devotion suffers, in my opinion, from a crisis of both over-explanation and insufficient understanding. Numerous studies have been published that would purport to explain Christian devotion to the Virgin Mary as the result of some foreign impulse that intruded the Christian faith, or as something fully comprehensible only in light of some modern intellectual discourse that reveals the peculiar logic underlying this reverence for Mary. Indeed, works taking such approaches are often among those most cited by non-specialists, particularly because they appear to operate outside of the confessional interests that govern more theologically oriented works, as I was just describing earlier. Nevertheless, at the same time, it is hard not to see such approaches as a kind of extension of the more avowedly Protestant view of Marian cult, as something grafted onto the Christian tradition only rather late in the game. As a result, Marian piety is effectively made out to be something so exotic, so discordant with the fabric of the Christian faith that external influences must be identified in order to comprehend its very existence, whether it be ancient goddess traditions or psychoanalysis or the eternal feminine or the anthropology of sacrifice. All of these are possibilities. Something else must explain why and how the early Christians turned to Mary in prayer and veneration. To be sure, there is nothing inherently wrong with such perspectives in their own right, and all are immensely valuable for the light they can shed on many facets of Marian devotion and its origins. Feminist critiques of Mary's overwhelmingly patriarchal representation are particularly needful and welcome. But the problem here is, as one specialist on early Marian piety rightly observes, that all of this abundance of explanation has in fact prevented us from recognizing that we actually lack a historical reconstruction of the rise of the cult of the Virgin. So much emphasis on discovering the skeleton key that unlocks the mystery of Christian devotion to Mary has left us without an account of early Marian piety that describes how the basic principles undergirding these influential beliefs and practices actually arose from a logic native to the early Christian tradition itself. Instead, devotion to the Virgin is presented as something largely anomalous to the Christian tradition, a historical oddity that requires some sort of dramatic explanation for its genesis. By comparison, for instance, it is hard to imagine a similar urgency being given to discovering why on earth so many Christians were devoted to St. Thecla or to St. Mary of Magdala. Something peculiar seems to be at work in many of these approaches to the development of Marian piety. Of all these different options, the goddess explanation has certainly proven to be the most popular, and so perhaps it warrants briefly some direct attention. On the one hand, there is no denying that Mary's representation and veneration have been deeply colored by the influence of earlier traditions derived from the worship of various goddesses in the ancient Mediterranean world. Yet on the other hand, these similarities are often superficial in nature, and they can frequently distract from more fundamental differences at both the conceptual and practical levels, as is also true more broadly of the early Christian devotion to the saints. It is a profound mistake, I think, to imagine that such parallels should somehow explain the origins of the cult of Mary, and likewise reveal it as something exogenous to the Christian tradition. The simple truth of the matter is that a great deal of traditional Christian faith and practice reflects earlier precedents from the Greco-Roman world, not only in the case of the veneration of the saints more generally, but in other areas as well, such as the Eucharist, or, for goodness sakes, Christmas, right? So much of early Christian culture was deeply imprinted by Hellenistic precedents that one must wonder, again, why the influence of goddess traditions on Marian piety should somehow be singled out so, as it often has been. And as scholars have increasingly come to recognize, in any case, the sort of Christian-pagan dichotomy that underlies this kind of explanation is largely a false one, particularly in late antiquity. Moreover, a few scholars have drawn attention to the fact that these kinds of appeals to the quote-unquote pagan origin, it's another one of those words I'm not supposed to use, pagan origin of certain Christian beliefs and practices, and particularly the veneration of saints, derived largely from Protestant invectives against Roman Catholicism, or similarly, Enlightenment rationalist critiques against what are considered vulgar, common religious practices. Of course, this sort of misuse does not mean that we should accordingly abandon the comparative history of religions, right? Far from it. No, that's what I do, it's my job, right? Rather, we must instead be aware that this approach is not always ideologically neutral and may often reflect various sorts of inherent bias. And in the case of early Marian piety, it is often hard to miss such undertones. Protestant writers have often emphasized the influence of ancient goddess traditions in order to make devotion to Mary appear as something foreign to the Christian tradition, framing the rise of Marian cult in terms of her gradual deification rather than as a fairly ordinary development of late ancient Christian piety. So while parallels between ancient goddesses and early Marian piety of course remain significant for the history of religion, they do not explain the emergence of Christian devotion to Mary, and likewise should not be allowed to control its interpretation in the way that one finds in some previous scholarship. Instead, quoting another scholar of early Marian devotion, we must approach Marian piety from the perspective that, I quote, no religious development of such importance can be explained in simple or monocausal terms. Pagan syncretism, right, its fusion with pagan traditions, may have played a part, but in my view, in her view, it was a minor one. Competition would be a better model for how we think about these things, end quote. So, rather than looking for some external cause or explanation, I propose that we should instead seek to understand the origins of Marian piety primarily on terms taken from within the Christian tradition itself. Devotion to Mary is, in fact, a product of early Christian culture that grew naturally out of its concerns with Christology and virginity, and most especially, the practice of venerating saints. There is simply no need to find some sort of outside influence that was responsible for Christian veneration of the Virgin Mary. It was implicit in the patterns of early Christian discourse. Of course, there is again no question that precedents from the ancient Mediterranean goddesses and insights from modern social sciences can offer perspectives for studying this phenomenon. Yet at the same time, it seems absolutely essential to understand Christian devotion to Mary as something arising from within the Christian tradition itself. The cult of the Virgin must have had a powerful resonance with other central elements of early Christian discourse and practice for it to have achieved the remarkable success that it did. This becomes most evident as we begin to situate the emergence of devotion to Mary within the broader context of emergent Christian devotion to the saints. For that is how the cult of the Virgin should be understood in early Christianity, as simply one variation, albeit a remarkable one, of the nascent cult of the saints. To be sure, Mary quickly emerged, even in this period, as a saint whose petitions and influence with her son surpassed that of other potential advocates. Likewise, we can see that already in late antiquity, the Virgin had begun to acquire some of the accolades and attributes that would ultimately lead to her elevation above the rest of the company of the saints as a kind of super saint, especially in the late medieval and early modern West. Indeed, in these later periods, Mary sometimes came to be regarded as almost superhuman and was elevated dangerously close to equal footing with her son. Nevertheless, I will not attempt to account for these more recent developments in the medieval and modern West, since these elements are largely foreign to Mary's veneration in late antiquity. And moreover, one can consult any number of fine studies on these aspects of medieval Marian piety. Yet at the same time, it would appear that this exaltation of Mary in later Western Christianity is at least partly responsible for many of the overdetermined, as I see them, explanations of Marian piety that I've just mentioned. A focus on these later developments has occasionally distorted scholarly perceptions of early Marian piety, and thereby inspired the search for a more dramatic cause for her cult, right? The idea is people see this medieval veneration of Mary and think, oh, that's what we must be looking for then in the early church. And actually, it's not. It's very different. And while the near apotheosis of Mary in some quarters of the Roman Catholic tradition may perhaps warrant the identification of some extraordinary catalyst, as the other things I mentioned before, although I remain skeptical that something like that's needed, these later developments need not concern us as we try to understand the beginnings of early Christian devotion to Mary. Instead, we need to dial things back a bit from the medieval Mary in order to better understand her role in ancient Christian faith and practice. At this stage, she was effectively a saint among other saints who was revered for her exceptional purity and holiness, as well as her intimacy with her son. a more modest status that she retains more or less in much of the Christian East up to the present day. I'm going to need to skip some of this. There's been, as I've mentioned, kind of widespread assumption in the scholarship that it's only after the Council of Ephesus in the middle of the 5th century that Marian piety begins. And in fact, there's been some effort to push this even later into the 6th century. Right? This is very common in the scholarship to see there was no devotion to Mary really until the 6th century. There were no feasts of Mary. There were no churches developed to Mary. Her veneration developed so much later than all of these other saints. And often, one particular saint, a saint I mentioned previously, Saint Thecla, is enlisted for the comparison here. Right? Saint Thecla, if you don't know, Saint Thecla is quite a remarkable woman from the early Christian tradition. Right? She was a missionary associate of Saint Paul, who we know quite a bit about from early Christian literature and legend. And Thecla's cult was very popular. She was one of the most popular female saints, and her cult develops pretty early. And so it's been widely maintained that Thecla was really the first focus, the first female figure that was a major focus of Christian devotion, and that Mary's devotion developed only much later. And I'm here to say, wrong. That is not true. In fact, by every measure, in every conceivable place we might look, we can find that devotion to Mary is just as early. And it's developing just in the same context of the cult of the saints that I've been elaborating here. In many respects, Thecla is an ideal figure for this kind of comparison with Mary, given who she was. Even if it turns out that she was not, in fact, more popular and influential in early Christianity than the Virgin Mary, it seems safe to say, at least, that this missionary companion of Paul was the only female figure in early Christianity whose popularity could possibly rival that of Jesus' mother. But here, as we shall see now in what follows, evidence for early devotion to Mary actually compares quite favorably with that for Thecla, and in many cases is much better, which basically means it goes back really as far as the beginning of the cult of the saints in general. Now, in making the case for Thecla's priority, scholars have pointed to a famous pilgrimage itinerary written by a woman named Egeria, a Spanish pilgrim who in 384 visited the Holy Land, and in her travels, she stopped on the way at a shrine of St. Thecla on the southern coast of Turkey, which is the place where, according to another of these apocryphal texts, these extra-biblical texts, the Acts of Paul and Thecla, Thecla completed her life. Right? In addition, scholars argue that Thecla's depiction in visual art and on pilgrimage souvenirs, as well as the existence of a 5th century collection of Thecla's life and her miracles, are clear indications that she had an early active cult. By contrast, it is argued that in the case of the Virgin, this kind of evidence that is plentiful for the cult of Thecla from the 4th and 5th centuries tends not to be found, and here it is, until the late 6th or 7th centuries. That is roughly 200 years later. But hold on, I'm going to tell you, this is not true. Despite the frequent assertion of Marian veneration's tardy arrival by any number of scholars of early Christianity, the truth of the matter is that on the whole, the earliest evidence for the cult of the Virgin is not significantly later, particularly if one looks beyond the environs of Constantinople, the imperial capital. This has been one of the problems. One of the problems with earlier scholarship is simply looking at the church fathers. Another problem has been really looking at the literature of the imperial capital, Constantinople, which is a common problem, actually, for some people working in this period. So that's been one problem. But as has long been well known, the earliest shrines to the Virgin were established not in Constantinople, but rather in Jerusalem, already by the first decades of the 5th century, if not even earlier. Now, admittedly, this is some 40 years after we first learn of Thecla's shrine in what's today Turkey. But one certainly has to wonder, are several decades really evidence that Mary's cult was late on the scene, or is this difference simply a matter of serendipity? Specialists who work on the early liturgies of Jerusalem would tend to suggest it's the latter. It's really just kind of an accident, right? And several scholars have even proposed that in all probability, the shrines of Mary in Jerusalem, the annual feast of Mary commemorated at them, probably go back to the later 4th century, that is to exactly the same time as this shrine of Thecla. And not only that, but around the same time that we find the first clear evidence for these Jerusalem shrines at the beginning of the 5th century, a famous church in Rome you may have heard of, the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore, was just being finished, even at the same time that this third council I've been talking about in Ephesus was itself meeting in 431 in a church dedicated to Mary. In terms of literary production, the Protevangelium of James, which I've mentioned, certainly offers a worthy rival to this account of Thecla's ministry, the Acts of Paul and Thecla that I mentioned. And so judging from that basis, the early Christians of the latter 2nd century seem to have held at least as much interest in the mother of Jesus as in this missionary companion of Paul. And Mary can certainly best Thecla in this arena as we move into the later centuries. An account of Mary's life and miracles dates to the 4th century, at least a century before we find the life and miracles of Thecla. And in all probability, another similar Marian narrative dates to the 3rd century and is, I think, possibly even earlier than that. Both of these early Marian texts, one must note, additionally bear witness to the practice of intercessory prayer to the Virgin. And the 4th century narrative in particular reveals a highly developed cult of the Virgin, including 3 annual feasts in her honor in the 4th century. The 2 writings in question are the earliest surviving accounts of the end of Mary's life, that is, her Dormition and Assumption. You knew I had to get back to that. And one wonders whether the classification of these writings as apocrypha rather than hagiography may have contributed to their neglect in understanding of Marian devotion, right? I mean, to explain this a little, right? Hagiography, that's the life of a saint. Apocrypha, that's a book that got kicked out of the Bible, right? So a book that gets kicked out of the Bible, that's not a good book. We don't want to be reading that, right? But a life of the saint is something you want to be reading. So, well, which is this? This is a life of Mary, right? If it's apocrypha, it gets marginalized. If it's life of the saint, it's brought into the mainstream. And I wonder if this has something to do with part of the problem. Although these texts have been largely ignored by scholars of early Christianity and to the present, it is no exaggeration to say that they are equal in importance to the Protevangelium of James for understanding Mary's significance in early Christian tradition and the rise of her cult. The first of these 2 early Marian narratives is a work often known in the scholarly literature by its Latin title, the Liber Requiae Mariae, or in English, which I prefer, the Book of Mary's Repose. The entire work survives only in a translation into classical Ethiopic, which may be another reason it didn't get all the press it deserved. But it's a translation that seems to have been made in late antiquity, probably not long after the conversion of Ethiopia, which takes place in the 4th century. And there are also substantial fragments of these texts, again, in some pretty weird languages, Syriac and Old Georgian. And no doubt, the Apocryphon's survival, or the hagiography's survival, depending on how we want to call this thing, in these lesser-known languages, in part explains why it has been so long overlooked. The Greek original of this Book of Mary's Repose dates most likely to the 3rd century, though I think it's possible that it might be even earlier. In comparison with the Protevangelium, this narrative is much less obsessed with Mary's purity and holiness. That's what the Protevangelium is about, how pure and how holy Mary is. The Book of Mary's Repose, instead, presents Mary as a much more active figure who possesses a superior understanding of the Christian faith and is revered by the apostles and other members of the Christian community. The story itself, which relates Mary's glorious departure from this world and the miraculous transfer of her body to paradise, is unmistakably designed to highlight Mary's uniquely exalted status among the followers of Christ. Yet the text also is strikingly heterodox, unorthodox, right? In sharp contrast to this previous text I mentioned, the Protevangelium, which is stalwartly orthodox. In the Book of Mary's Repose, for instance, Jesus is identified as a manifestation of, quote, the great cherub of light, end quote. I still don't know exactly what that is. And the text is riddled with concepts and vocabulary that would be actually much more at home in a Gnostic Christian context than a more emergent Orthodox one. And indeed, the theological peculiarities of this ancient apocryphon alone, regardless of what it has to offer about Mary, should warrant it broader consideration within the study of early Christianity than it has yet received. Perhaps most noteworthy for our purposes, however, is the evidence that this Book of Mary's Repose provides for nascent Marian veneration, already by the 3rd century, it would seem. Particularly in its conclusion, as Mary is given a tour of the places of the damned in the company of the apostles, the power of her intercessions on behalf of sinners is made known. For this reason, some scholars have even proposed that maybe these traditions of Mary's Dormition and Assumption first emerged in the 2nd century in order to validate a practice then that was already existing of intercessory prayer to the Virgin. This, I think, is an intriguing hypothesis that merits some further consideration. I haven't really seen much evidence to support it yet, though. Yet it is worth noting here that this earliest evidence for the veneration of Mary appears to come from within a markedly heterodox, that is, unorthodox, theological milieu. This could seem to suggest, as I noted briefly already, that the cult of the Virgin had its origins somewhere outside of the emergent Orthodox stream of early Christianity. And perhaps this is the reason that explains the relative silence of many early Orthodox church fathers about Mary, right? It's something that a different, theologically different group of Christians first engages in. So I don't know if that's the case. It's one possibility. The second of these two important early Dormition narratives is a work known as the 6 Books Dormition Apocryphon. We call it that because it's divided into 6 books. Although this text is best preserved in several Syriac manuscripts, Syriac is Christian Aramaic language, several Syriac manuscripts from the 5th and 6th centuries. So this is the actual manuscript they're written on is from the 5th and the 6th century. The Greek original that they're translating and its traditions date almost certainly to the middle of the 4th century, if not perhaps even earlier. And this much is indicated especially by the apparent connection of this narrative with a peculiar group of early Christians that we only know from polemic against them, a group known as the Collyridians in some contexts, the Marianites in some others, and they are condemned, interestingly enough, for excessively venerating Mary. They are condemned as heretics because they love Mary too much. And it seems that this text actually has some very specific points of contact with this group. Yet most significantly, this 6 books Dormition Apocryphon provides striking evidence for an early cult of the Virgin, and a very developed one, nearly a century before the events of the Council of Ephesus. It reveals a remarkably advanced level of Marian veneration, including, in addition to frequent intercessory prayers offered to the Virgin, now also an organized cult with annual feasts, miracles ascribed to the Virgin, and even Marian apparitions, and what are, I think, some of the earliest attestations of Marian apparitions in the early Christian tradition, going back to the 4th century. Judging from this early Dormition narrative, there seems to be little question that the cult of the Virgin had already attained a high degree of complexity by the middle of the 4th century. And once again, it is seemingly noteworthy that in this instance, emergent Marian veneration is also linked with an allegedly marginal group that at least some of the early church fathers considered heretical. Now, in all fairness, there is absolutely nothing at all heterodox about the 6 books Apocryphon. Or, I would also venture to say, this group that's being condemned for their veneration of Mary. Their veneration of Mary just it seems exactly like what will be normal 100 years later. They were just a little ahead of the game, and some of the more conservative church fathers didn't like it, it seems. So even though the group that they're associated with is condemned as theologically transgressive, there's nothing unorthodox about this text. But at the same time, it, again, maybe just leads us a little in this direction. And I am truly just hinting at this. I don't know that I think this, but it is one possible explanation that the reason we have this strange silence is that the origins of this were not originally among the Orthodox Catholic Christians, but other kinds of Christian groups. So anyway, in terms of literary evidence, the cult of the Virgin actually fares better than our other first female saint, St. Thecla. It is true, however, that Mary is not quite as visible in early church decoration and pilgrimage art as Thecla. But again, the difference is not dramatic. Representations of the Virgin in art are largely absent during the first few centuries, which is hardly a surprise, given that very little in the way of distinctively Christian art survives from before the early 4th century. The only possible exceptions to this would be certain representations in the Roman catacombs. But the interpretation of these images is often difficult and subject to considerable debate. Right? The question is it or is it not Mary in many instances, or is it just some woman? Still, there is a strong possibility that we find there depictions of Mary in a funerary context dating from the 3rd century. Much more certain are depictions of Mary as an orans in this position of prayer, right, on gold glass from 4th century Rome. And actually, a recent article was just published that identified several new articles. I only came across this about 3-4 months ago. Early objects of art depicting Mary. But still, it's not really until the 5th century that we begin to find representations of Mary in art in any significant numbers. Although I would say, again, this is fairly typical for most saints. This does not make Mary unusual. Much more important is the evidence for early Marian piety that we find in liturgical sources. This is another area where we lack much evidence in general for the first few centuries of Christianity. But Mary is surprisingly well represented in some of the earliest witnesses to Christian worship. Perhaps the most noteworthy of these is a prayer to Mary on a papyrus, right, a little scrap of paper, from Egypt that dates to the 3rd or 4th century. It's a famous Sub Tuum Praesidium prayer. It's still a prayer that's in use. It's a very ancient prayer. It means beneath your protection, basically. It's a prayer for Mary's intercessions. But there's also evidence of liturgical feasts commemorating the Virgin from the later 4th and early 5th centuries in several major urban centers. Jerusalem emerges as the most significant of these, not in the least because its early liturgies are especially well documented, but also because it is the site of the 2 earliest and most important Marian shrines. Among the most remarkable service books to survive from the ancient Jerusalem church is surely the recently published Chant Book, a work extant only in Old Georgian translation that preserves a large corpus of the Sunday hymns from public worship in Jerusalem during the late 4th and early 5th centuries. In this collection, we find ample evidence that Mary's intercessions were regularly sought throughout the Sunday worship of Jerusalem in the period prior to the Council of Ephesus, along with the substantial corpus of specifically Marian hymnography that dates to the early 5th century. In this respect, the evidence for early Marian veneration exceeds considerably what we find for the liturgical cult, not only of Thecla, but indeed of most other early Christian saints as well. It is a bit peculiar, perhaps, that we find evidence of an active cult of the Virgin well before we have clear confirmation of a shrine dedicated to her. Typically, a saint's shrine was fundamental in the emergence of a cult, particularly in the case of the martyrs. The cult of the martyrs began at the graveside, where early Christians would gather to commemorate their local martyrs and seek their prayers on the anniversary of their death. The saint's grave and his or her relics provided the main locus for offering intercessory prayers and other ritual activities. Yet, with no martyrdom and no relics for Mary, remember, right, her body, it would appear that a shrine was not as important to the emergence of the cult of the Virgin as it may have been for many other saints. And the evidence would seem to suggest that her veneration may have initially emerged in the absence of a specific cultic center. There were, of course, other possible locations for a shrine besides a grave, and one of the earliest centers of Marian cult developed at an alternative site for the Nativity of Christ, midway between Jerusalem and Bethlehem. Right? Actually, some of the very earliest traditions about the Nativity say it didn't happen in Bethlehem. They never made it to Bethlehem. The baby came forth halfway between Jerusalem and Bethlehem. And this is a very ancient tradition, particularly in the Jerusalem area. And once things got shifted to Bethlehem, one of the things they could do to repurpose this shrine was say, let's make it a shrine to Mary, which it seems is exactly what they did. So this was one of the earliest shrines for Mary. But around the same time, almost simultaneously, the Virgin's empty tomb in the Garden of Gethsemane also emerged as a locus of her special veneration. And as the cult of the Virgin rapidly expanded and took hold of the Christian world during the 5th century, this church, the church of her tomb in Jerusalem, quickly took pride of place as the foremost Marian shrine. Like so many other saints, then, Mary's cult ultimately came to focus on her tomb, empty though it was. And in the absence of bodily relics, items of her clothing would eventually be discovered in order to evoke her holy presence within her shrines, especially in the imperial capital, Constantinople. As for the silence of the church fathers, here's another explanation, a very different one than that it starts off in a heterodox context. Perhaps this is just a matter of what we call the lex orandi of ancient Christianity being a little ahead of its lex credendi. That, right, lex orandi, the law of prayer, it's practices of prayer, it's practices of devotion, it's liturgies. Marian piety is developing faster in these areas than it is in its lex credendi, right? The law of believing, right? The doctrine of the church. Doctrine about Mary is developing perhaps slower than popular practice of venerating. A look at the broader history of Marian veneration suggests that this is quite probable. Time and again, popular devotion to the Virgin outpaced Mariological doctrine. And only gradually would theologians and bishops yield to the will of Mary's faithful devotees, adjusting their doctrinal formulations and liturgies to account for her new attributes and accolades. In this regard, I quote one scholar who works on later Marian stuff, the nature of Marian belief is people-led, she says. And it turns out as well that one of the main places that this people-led Marian belief manifests itself is in the Marian apocryphal literature of early and medieval Christianity. And this often is where we find the kind of conceptual and devotional vanguard of Marian piety in the Middle Ages. And actually, I'm saying that's maybe one possibility we need to think about for the early Christian period as well. These texts formed an anonymous and popular corpus that was not authored by clergy or theologians, but which nonetheless exerted steady pressure on what we might call quote-unquote official religion. At times, these kind of popular developments in Marian devotion were rejected for their excesses, but often they were, what we might say, prophetic, propelling existing faith and practice in new directions. Presumably, a similar dynamic as what we see in the Middle Ages could have been at work in early Christian piety as well. Well, as for the Council of Ephesus, and I'm bringing it back to the beginning and to the end, what happened there? It would appear is not the beginnings of the cult of the Virgin, as many have previously assumed, but rather what we see at the Council of Ephesus, the Third Ecumenical Council, is the embrace and promotion of an already existing set of practices by the Roman Empire and by its imperial church. These political developments, this fusion of Marian veneration with imperial identity, bear the primary responsibility for the explosion of Marian piety that we witness in the Roman Empire in the middle of the 5th century. Right, this fusion of devotion to Mary with the Christian Empire and its church would subsequently then dramatically transform Mary's image and the nature of her veneration, so that actually she very soon emerges as the patroness of the Roman or Byzantine Empire, as we want to call it, and its imperial capital, Constantinople. She is like the mascot of the Roman Empire. She's its divine protectress as this tradition goes forward. And this is a very interesting set of developments, maybe one I'll get to some other day. Thank you very much. Joe.
Thank you. I agree with you. It was great. The pre-council of Ephesus, Marian emerging. I do have a question. I've always been fascinated by the Protevangelium of James and the focus on Mary in the temple. So there's a lot of Mary. She grows up in the temple.
Yep.
She's fed by angels
Yep.
at the foot of the altar in
Yep.
the temple. she turns 12 years old, and the elders of the temple get together and say, Mary must now leave the temple because she becomes a woman, and
Right.
we know about
Impurity.
blood and impurity. So I agree with you on the focus on purity and that sort of thing. And then, of course, she ends up with Joseph. But my question really is, that is such an early text, so focused on Mary and the temple. The temple looms large, and I'm fascinated by that role that the temple plays with Mary in that text. So I wonder if it's not just about Mary's purity, that text, but also about, in the 2nd century, as you know, early Christianity is still negotiating its roots in Judaism and its relationship to Judaism and its sacred pedigree related to Jerusalem and the temple, and that Mary even becomes this sort of bridge figure to help in that negotiation. So I'm so glad you brought that text up, and I just wondered if you might say a little bit more about that role of the temple and Mary in that text, and if there is any other text that pits them together as that does.
Thank you. If any of you haven't read the Proto-Evangelium of James, do it. It's a great text. It's really fun. It's amazing, and it's very early. And it has a lot. It determines a lot of nativity traditions. It determines the representation of the nativity in Christian art. So it's actually not in Bethlehem. It's in the middle of nowhere on the side of the road in a cave because of this early tradition. There have been a lot of different ways of reading this text, and some people would read it yet another way and say it's really an apologetic text about Jesus, and it really has nothing to do with Mary. It's all about sort of making Jesus look good. I think it does that, but I'm not convinced that that's its major purpose. It's really, really, really about Mary, and it goes to great pains to emphasize Mary as what one writer calls it. She's an object of sacred purity. And in this sense, she is like the temple itself, right? She's an object in which the holiness of the divine is present. Not in an incarnate way, right? I mean, the temple isn't holy as an incarnation of the Son of God in the way Christ is, right? But nonetheless, you don't go. No one but the priest can go into the Holy of Holies, right? You have to be in a state of purity, so Mary she is like a temple object. Not anyone can just go, say, touch her. So I think there is a connection between her purity and the purity of the temple that's going on. There are some readings of the Proto-Evangelium that it is kind of more in dialogue with a lot of early Judaism than I tend to think it is. I tend to find those readings less convincing. I think there is, the early Jewish tradition says Mary was no virgin, right? She had an affair with some Roman soldier. And I do think this text may already be starting to answer that kind of critique coming from Judaism. So it is in dialogue with Judaism, but I think it really is to me much more of a Greek text. It's in a Greek frame of mind. There is nothing else like this from so early. There's nothing else like this from before the 1st century that I can find. Yes, I really didn't do my job. I didn't solve the problem, and it is kind of unsolvable. I did my best, but it still is mind-boggling. What is this 2nd century text doing that has this really exalted view of Mary, and then we don't find it for so long? As far as the temple goes, the idea of Mary as the temple, I haven't traced that back as far as possible, but I know you see it in the 4th century, right? I mean, that's a very common typology of Mary going forward, that she is like the temple, because the temple held the presence of God, right? And so too did Mary, in holding God incarnate in her womb. So she's, as the temple, Holy of Holies, held the presence of God in a unique way. Well, no longer unique anymore, because Mary, in a comparable way, held that. So that's at work there. I don't know how much of that we can already project back onto the Proto-Evangelium. Is it already thinking of an idea of Mary as kind of a type of the temple, or vice versa, however you would put this? I don't know. Yes, Darcy.
Thank you. That was a very fun attempt to answer the question about.
I'm glad you like my attempt, because I agree. It was an attempt.
Question for you is touching on the last few minutes of the talk, relating the political aspect
Mm.
of, I guess, expanding the Marian cult in the Mediterranean world. And so my question is what would the relationship be with that and promoting the image of Constantine and some other Helena to promoting the Marian cult throughout the world?
As far as we can tell, the relationship to the empire doesn't go back that far, right? And when imperial authorities seem to get involved in this is exactly when I'm kind of proposing at the end. It seems it's right around the Council of Ephesus. And there's a lot of literature around the emperor at the time, the emperor's sister, Pulcheria, played a big role in promoting Marian devotion in the capital right around the time of Ephesus, and she was actively opposed to Nestorius because he said mean things about Mary. And in more recent years, that had come into question. And scholars had said, no, that's not really true. That was just sort of an apologetic strategy put forward by those who supported this guy Nestorius. Said it was like, oh, you know, he was fine. Some woman just came after him, right? And we see something like this with some of the other church fathers. A famous example is a guy named John Chrysostom, right? And his downfall is engineered by a powerful imperial woman. And we know that actually a lot of it simply had to do with bad politics rather than any kind of ideas. One of the things I've done in this book is I've actually tried to rehabilitate Pulcheria a little bit. I think the evidence is pretty strong that she had a very personal devotion to Mary herself. And she is clearly connected politically to all of the people who are against Nestorius. So, and we have people writing after the council saying, oh, Pulcheria, you're the best because you brought Nestorius down. You attacked him for saying these bad things about Mary. So I think there's something to this. And I think, so that's the moment when it happens. It's in the events of the Third Ecumenical Council, and it takes off like, what was it that I quoted Brian Daly saying? Like an explosion. A comet is what he says, right? It's like a comet. So.
Please join me in thanking Dr.